Happy Halloween, everyone, and to all my fellow witches, may the blessings of Samhain be upon you. It's that wonderful time of year again when the bumps at night get louder, the chills get stronger, and we absolutely love every minute. And so it's Halloween, and come on, really, I could not do Halloween without doing an episode all about witches. So yes, we are going to uncover some rather interesting stories. We're going to look at witchcraft in all areas, and included is the unfortunate witches, so-called, of yesterday. So join me as we peel the veil back in the darkness and see what's underneath. We all now know the stories of the unfortunate women that was accused of witchcraft in the past, and how they were basically just outcasts of the village. Very, very sad and very, very unfortunate. But then we also have the stories of a little bit more fairy tales, folklore, and hey, let's not forget how Hollywood and all the film industry has embraced the term witches and embraced the terminology of all the fae and the fairy folk that goes with it. But having a look back at the tales surrounding the villages or up in the hills becomes quite interesting. So who is to say that sometimes these herb women that lived in the forest all on their own weren't a little bit magic? And at the end of the day, if you can cast a spell, you're not really going to be burnt at the stake, are you? So let's go now hunting witches. Happy Halloween! I brought us now to the town of Caerwys, and excuse the glasses, it is a very, very bright afternoon, perfect for going adventuring. Fun fact about Caerwys before we start: it's actually the smallest town in Britain. Let's go and have a look. So here we are in Caerwys. Now, another fact about Caerwys is that it has been, or the area has been inhabited for over 4,000 years, with evidence of burial mounds and other artifacts being found in the surrounding area. And also, Caerwys is actually built on a limestone plateau. So limestone allows water to go through. So it has got underground springs, underground rivers, and water is also a conduit for spiritual activity. So we have got an area that is ripe for everything that we want to be looking for regarding witches, ghosties and spiritual activity. So this is the centre crossroads of Caerwys, and we have the old bell house here, we can see. Now this dates back to the 1500s, where the bell would be rung the time when the market would begin and end here. Drovers from miles around would be come with all their animals, their goods. Market traders would also descend, and believe it or not, this carried on all the way from the Middle Ages, and the last market was in the 1950s. How about that? Let's just go up here now. Bell house, very pretty, because I want us to go so you can see the black and white building up ahead that is actually empty. And that was the old courthouse. Now, according to rumour, there was supposed to be an underground tunnel that would lead from the courthouse across the road to somewhere obviously that's not there now, that was a jail. Now, if that doesn't look spooky, I don't know what does. So as you can see, been empty a long time. So you can see, so we've got a sign here. Now, I actually have an interesting story connected to the courthouse, and it's all about a female who worked in a local pub, as we would call it, and seemingly she refused the entry of a man who seemingly was already drunk and pushed him out the front of the pub. Now, he fell backwards and banged his head and died. So she was arrested and she was accused of murder, and in the courthouse she was sentenced to death. Now, unfortunately, she was actually hung just on the outskirts of town in an area of common land that's known as the Merrion, literally minutes before her pardon arrived at the courthouse. And supposedly she's one of the ghosts that goes from underneath the courthouse in the tunnels back and forward to the jail. Interesting. Now, it seemed that the area of Caerwys was considered such an area of strategic importance that the princes of Gwynedd actually had a palace built just down the road in Maesmenen. And it's an area renowned for walkers and hunters. You see gun dogs coming up now. Lovely place. So we're now in an area not far from what was known as the Merrion, which is common ground, common land, and unfortunately it was the area that was used for hanging, and they used to hang the criminals and unfortunate people, let's put it like that, that they claimed had done a particular deed. Now, also, if you hadn't known this, and I found this quite interesting as I was doing my research, we've all heard of the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, as he terrorised his way across England. In fact, 300 poor women in East Anglia alone he executed. Guess how many in Wales? All of Wales. 42. There were just 42 cases on record, and actually just 5 were executed as witches, and that's in the whole of Wales. Now, I tend to think of that mainly because Wales has a very rich pagan links, Druid ancestry, you know, regardless of how Christian-like they became, they were still very, very spiritual people. So an understanding of being connected to nature, I think, was very deep in them. Interesting. 42 cases, 5 executed. So we're here still on the outskirts of Caerwys, and it really is a lovely area. You can see how much it still is a very, very strong farming community, and why this was such a strong hub for the markets and the drovers and the tradespeople to gather. Nice. Now, it's only a few miles from here that the actual first female was executed for witchcraft. And this poor lady, she was only in her late 40s, widow, which seemed to be a strong link for most of the witch cases. But she was a healer, and she did make charms and potions, etc., with a herb lore. And she was well respected until she was called to the bedside of Lewis ap John, who had been sick for a long time. Now, to be fair to this lady, and her name was Gwen, she turned to the family and said, "Look, I'm sorry, I can't do anything for him. You know, he's too far gone, he is going to die." And by saying those words, she then became accused of foretelling his death, because Lewis did die. And her reputation started to go downhill. But then a female, a lady, came to see her and asked for a love charm, because she was having a secret affair with Sir Thomas Mostyn. And him being a local gentleman, it had to be kept very under wraps. And she was convinced that he wasn't really serious about her. So she asked for a charm. And unfortunately, Gwen gave her a charm. And this charm was then found in the property of Thomas Mostyn. And suddenly everything changed. She was accused of creating evil magic, and regardless of all the people that she'd helped, she was then sentenced to be hanged in Denby's Town Square. Nobody stood to help her, regardless of the kind deeds that she had done in the past. This simple piece of paper condemned her. Very sad. I've brought us to an area just on the outskirts of Caerwys to recount this story, and it's early morning. Beautiful area. Well worth an explore to find stories of the witches. So Caerwys is quite a hive of activity. However, in this area, it's a story of a witch, a wise woman, a healer, whatever you want to class her as. And so the story goes, she used to go into Caerwys, selling her ware, getting a lot of abuse, getting a lot of maybe violence even, and certainly where the children are concerned, name calling, etc., etc., as unfortunately people do when they decide to pick on the victim. So suddenly, for whatever reason, once it came to the last strike of midnight from the bells, all the children in the village would start screaming. All the children in the village would suffer from extreme nightmares, and this went on night after night after night. Screaming, crying. Obviously the parents weren't getting much sleep, the children certainly weren't getting much sleep, and they were being scared to even go to bed at night. So what were the parents to do? And we are talking possibly back in the Middle Ages here. So they went to the church. They spoke to the priest or vicar there at the time and begged for help. No problem, I can sort this. Pray. We need to pray. Okay, let's pray. So during Mass and the services, over a period of time, he prayed. Nothing happened. So the villagers decided to take matters into their own hand. They would go up to the woods and speak to her herself. So the group of them travelled through the woods up to the old lady's cottage, little run-down shack really at the time, banged on the door and shouted for answers. She never came out. They waited and waited, nothing. So they went back home. That night again, worse than ever, the children screamed. The nightmares had increased and the children's healths were really becoming a problem. Sickness and that began. That's enough, these villagers said. They went back up to the woods. Again, demanded her to come out. She refused. So, I suppose you could say in fits of rage, they decided to take matters into their own hands. And horrifically, they've surrounded the cottage, collected wood, placed it all around the walls, and set it afire. And as the flames engulfed the cottage, they suddenly began to hear screams from inside. The witch was burning. Once they were satisfied that the cottage was fully engulfed, they set off back to the town of Caerwys, back to their families, back to their children, and waited. And surprise, surprise, that night there was no nightmares. There was no screaming and crying. It had stopped. Surprisingly though, it is said that no remains were found ever of the witch's cottage. But some people have reported finding the remains of like smouldering building in the woods. Not warm, but just that smell of it having been on fire. And when they go back shortly afterwards to the same place, it's gone. There's also reports of seeing the glow of fire from the woods, but upon investigation, nothing. So, fact or fiction, the cries of the children ended. The town became happy again. And hey ho, as they thought, the witch was dead. Now, in this area of woodland outside Caerwys, whether the witch had used an old shepherd cottage or something like that, there is the site of a very, very old encampment here. This is supposed to have been abandoned long, long ago, somewhere around 1400s. And prior to that, there was also earthworks found back to the prehistoric period. So, who knows whether the witch actually lived in an old cottage, or whether or not she may still be living here still, somewhere in the woods outside Caerwys. Let's visit the town. And so here we are at the entrance of St Michael's Church in Caerwys. And if you remember with the story of our witch in the woods, this is the church where the townsfolk came, and during Mass it was said that they prayed for her to stop, as they thought, torturing the children and giving the children all the nightmares. And this is also where supposedly it didn't work. But it is another very old church, another very old beautiful church. with some very lovely old graves as well. Very interesting. Still some very old ones here, some going back there to, I think it says 1600 and something. So we've entered into the church, and I am going to be very respectful whilst being here. Church actually was begun in the 14th century, so most definitely at the time of when our story of the witch in the woods began. The information all about it. And again, how important Caerwys was to the area. But it is a lovely old church. We'll go outside now. So we've come back outside because I think they are preparing for some sort of event in the church, so obviously we have to be respectful. Now, a little fun fact, whilst we're looking around this beautiful church, is that in the 1600s in Caerwys there worked a man who worked as a barber surgeon called Thomas Wynne. He lived just on the outskirts, but he decided to take his chance over in the New World, as in America, and he sailed over to America in 1682. Now, what made this Thomas Wynne so interesting is he actually did make his fortune over there, and he became one of the leading people instrumental in creating what we now know as Philadelphia. And the actual grid pattern of the streets of Philadelphia are modelled on the grid pattern of Caerwys. So there we go. Philadelphia is actually a big Caerwys. And so as I'm just about to prepare to leave Caerwys, as a final note, the last person, the last female to be executed as a witch was Margaret Richards, and she was hanged in Beaumaris on Anglesey in 1655. Sadly, there's not a lot of information about this case. All that we have is, again, Margaret was a widow and a herb woman and a charmer, and after some interactions with a female called Gwen Meredith, Gwen became ill and then she died, and all fingers suddenly then got pointed at Margaret. With little or no more evidence, she was found guilty and hanged outside Beaumaris, and she was only, again, mid-40s. So sad. Now I have here quite a nice, heartwarming story of a spinster who lived in a village called Llanasa in North Wales, and she went by the name of Dorothy Griffiths, and this happened in the mid-1600s. Now, she was accused of bewitching a number of people in Llanasa. However, 31 people came out in support of Dorothy. So while she was held in prison, accused of witchcraft, she was put up in front of 2 judges, and 31 people petitioned for her freedom, talking of her good character and of how the accusations were lies. And in the end, Dorothy was freed. Most of us will have heard of the famous Salem witch trials in America, where more than 200 people were accused. And we've got the Pendle witches in England of 1612. These obviously have given rise to many books, films, documentaries, and let's be honest, most of them were again still innocent people being persecuted. And this has continued, believe it or not, to the present day. Countries such as Papua New Guinea and Sub-Saharan Africa unfortunately still persecute innocent children and women and some men, and carry out horrific violence, mutilations, and even burn people alive under the guise of witchcraft when they literally do nothing. Very sad, very, very sad. But seriously, if you are one of the all-powerful witches with the skills to fly, shapeshift, and cause serious harm that people seem to be getting accused of, I actually believe that some people need to look over their shoulders when they are accusing innocent people like this, because they might actually end up accusing a real, powerful witch.